Hi, everyone. Welcome again to the Ohio Family Engagement Leadership Summit. We are glad that you could join us on this day of professional learning meant to take family school community partnership to the next level. My name is Max Zhang, and I will be this session's moderator. This session is workshop session 1, Deepening Student Voice, Students as Partners in Learning and Change. If you have any questions, concerns, or technical issues, please message me privately in the chat. To ensure that all get the most out of today, we ask that all our participants turn off their webcams and microphones. If you have questions for the presenter, please use the chat feature and we'll take it from there. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Be sure to use the hashtag OHSummit23 to share your thoughts. Now, it's my privilege to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Dana Mitra, who is the professor of education policy studies at the Pennsylvania State University. Dana is the founding editor of the International Journal of Student Voice and the co-editor of the American Journal of Education. She has published over 60 papers on the topics of student voice, civic engagement, and making a difference. Her books include Civic Education in the Elementary Grades, Promoting Engagement in an Era of Accountability, and Student Voice in School Reform, Building Youth-Adult Partnerships that Strengthen Schools and Empower Youth. Dana also works as a leadership coach, as well as offering workshops and coaching faculty on finding one's purpose as an academic and navigating the unspoken rules of the profession, including publishing and career advancement. Dana holds a PhD from Stanford University in Educational Administration and Policy Analysis. Her prior work experience includes teaching elementary school in the Washington, D.C. area and serving as the coordinator for 2 White House conferences on character education. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Mitra.
Hi, everybody. And yes, I'll share the Canvas slides as a PDF after. This is my first foray into Canva. So I am learning the ropes as we go along. If folks could just say hello in the chat, and later on in the session, I'm going to break you up according to the type of role that you play. So if you're a family liaison person or a principal or a parent or, whatever it is, you could just say hello and let me know what type of role you play. That'll make it easier for me to sort that out whenever we do some interactive activities. So hello, Elizabeth, AmeriCorps reading tutor. That's amazing. Hi, Whitney from the Ohio Family Student Engagement Center. We have Casey, a community partner manager. Krista Dickens, an SST consultant. Denise Morrison Clay, another reading tutor. Now they're coming in fast, so I might not be able to say them all. Megan Moore, a family advocate, an FCE consultant from Kim is, and we have a parent engagement coordinator. Terrific. Okay. This is helping me to get a sense, and keep them coming, and we'll start. So today is going to be a mix of some interactive activities and me giving you some information. So our topic today is Deepening Student Voice, Partners in Learning and Change. This presentation was designed by myself and my colleagues, Jerusha Connor, who's a professor at Villanova University, and Sammy Holquist, who is a research scientist at Child Trends. And Sammy is the Canva whiz and had developed this presentation for a previous format. So that's why we're doing Canva. So some things we're going to be doing today. I'll give you an overview of what student voice is and what it looks like in classrooms and school. I'll share a really short video from students. It's hard to do a presentation of student voice without giving you some student voices. We're going to have some breakout sessions where you're going to puzzle through some things that you might be working on. And then I'll leave you with some practical tools that, again, I think probably the easiest way for you to reach them is when I can send them hopefully to you all in a PDF form. So before we get started, I wanted to acknowledge I'm coming from Penn State University, State College, Pennsylvania. It's a big football weekend here against, I want to say, Iowa. I rent my house out, so I'm leaving shortly to go to Lancaster, PA to see my son play soccer. But the Pennsylvania State Universities are on the ancestral and current lands of the Erie, Haudenosaunee, Lenni, Lenape, Shawnee, Susquehannock, Washazazi, and Dakota nations, and past, present, and future. So we are working to create spaces where students and adults can partner in inequalities and inequities, and in doing so, we want to acknowledge the land that we're working on. So let's look at student voice. I would love for you, oh, Ashley, yes, we are, and then we're supposed to say Penn State afterwards. Okay. So the way that we define student voice, and while I'm giving this definition, I'd love for you to throw in the chat any ways that either your community is working and partnering with students, or things you would wish you're doing. We define them as opportunities for youth to share in school decision making in ways that will shape their lives and the lives of peers. It's about adults and youth collaborating together, mutual teaching and learning. In the literature, it has a lot of other names. Pupil voice, if it's coming from Europe, youth adult partnerships, and youth participatory action research may be some similar terms that you've heard. We try to separate, even though the word is student voice and that's what's been used in the literature, it's not just listening to students, but actually engaging students as partners. Oops. So let me, fingers crossed, share with you this
Hi,
video
I'm Paula
here.
Capo, and I'm a senior at Math and Science Academy.
Hi, my name is Bailey Bonds. I'm an 11th grader in Macomb, Mississippi, and I want to tell you a little bit about student voice at my school.
Hi, my name is Enrique Rosado. I'm currently a graduate student at Villanova University, pursuing a master's in higher education. I also do my undergraduate here, and I graduated with a bachelor in communication and a minor in Arab and Islamic Studies and Latin American Studies, and I graduated high school from the Ethical Culture Fields and School in New York.
I have had an adult ask for a respond to my voice in school. I think that it really allows you to be a part of your community and realize that you get to be a part of change making that happens often behind the scenes. And as a minority student, it makes you realize that you are important, you are a member, and you aren't being overlooked. I have actually recently created a club that was just geared towards making sure young people at my school had an opportunity to get their voices heard. The reason I created it was because I didn't feel that our administrators and board members had, a student group they could go to for asking questions, and I also wanted a group that could really hold our administrators accountable.
So in high school, there were various student voice opportunities, such as speaking at assemblies or being a part of a club, but not many of them led to meaningful change. A lot of it was very superficial opportunities and kind of just to calm the students down or to make them feel like they had a say. And so in 2016, some of the student leaders in my year, we led a walkout, and it was an entire day where we didn't go to class. We occupied the quad of the school, which is like the main part of campus. We had megaphones. We eventually were able to receive microphones, and it was just a day of kind of healing, and just allowing students of color, specifically and queer students, allowing them to speak out about what their experiences at Fieldston were, and allowing our white peers to just listen and be in that space and hear our stories.
There aren't a lot of opportunities to voice my opinion in school. However, I do find resources outside of my school. Some teachers will approach me and say, "What do you think will happen for the next lesson?" But it is not on a large scale. Bringing students to the table is very essential, and it could change a student's life.
If I had to give any advice for any teachers or principals in the U.S. regarding student voice, I would simply just say to give students a seat at the table. I think that financial assistance, assistance with organizing, with planning, I think all of that can come after students have that initial seat at the table and the ability to, speak with adults and be valued and be a part of a conversation that normally they wouldn't be able to even hear about because it's not for them or they're not old enough. And I think that first step would go a long way in improving the relationship between students, teachers, administration, etc.
The one advice I'd have for teachers and administrators is to realize that student voice doesn't have to happen in opposition. Teachers are in a really great position to help guide students through these really difficult issues that they're probably dealing with for the first time. I think that all students want is to be a part of this decision making and have it be meaningful. So just help be a part of that, guide students. That's all that we're asking for.
Right. I'm going to stop sharing for a second to make sure that I can get everything back to where it was before, because I was really trying to make sure that the sound was working for that for you all. Does anybody have any questions or any reactions to the video? And otherwise, I'm going to get into some more nitty-gritty parts of what this looks like. Okay. All right. Let me attempt to screen share again so that we can get back to that. Okay. So first of all, we're going to talk about student voice in schools. I want to make sure that I can see you all. I just lost my chat. Okay. And so I'm going to give you some examples of what that looks like. And these are from some of the research that I've done. And I'm giving you a lot of elementary school level examples, in part because I think we tend to think that this is something that only happened with students with certain levels of cognition or training. So this was an elementary school that did a set of things. One is they engaged in a whole school inquiry around rethinking the lunchroom guidelines. And this included every classroom having some input into this, the people who worked in the lunchroom, and it was a whole school inquiry, and they used something called dot-mocracy, where even the littlest ones could put dots next to the things they felt were important. The problem that created this need is that kids were being seated based on which lunch they were choosing. So like group one, who was getting the chicken, would go first and they would sit down. And what it meant was kids were choosing lunches that they weren't eating so they could sit with their friends. So they wanted to think through ways to reduce waste. And then on the far right side were all those fabulous ladies. And that is the Secretary of Health for Pennsylvania. These were fifth graders who really had a strong question about why on Fridays they couldn't get lunches that were more tailored to what they needed. So that was a group of folks where some were vegetarians, some didn't eat meat on Fridays, some had different dietary constraints, and the salad had meat on it. So they wanted to find a way that they could actually have a salad that aligned with what they needed. I started with just talking with the teacher, and the teacher taking that as, and this is really one of the critical steps in student voice, of hearing what the students were saying and taking the time and energy to say, what a great idea, let's really take this on, going to the principal and allowing these students to to gather data in the school and to make presentations to the district lunch people about what they wanted. And it got, so this was a nationwide publication on what they were doing. Some secondary school examples are, if you're wondering why students might be struggling or failing in the school, you really need to ask the kids who are failing. And a lot of times we partner with the most successful students, the head of the student council, etc. And while that could be useful for some responsibilities and some ideas, if we're trying to get at the core of issues of equity and struggle, then we need to partner with the kids who feel that they are not being served, and trusting that actually is a group that has enormous resources and capability to share what they need to share. So in a research project that I did, one way that this was done was in teacher professional development sessions, those days before school start in August. They brought in kids to help with redesigning curriculum, but not the kids for whom the curriculum was successful, but for whom the kids this was struggling. So Troy said, my job at the training session was breaking down vocabulary. Some students may not understand this reform effort, so we were trying to put the rubrics and the departmental standards in a way, in language where all students understand. I guess you could say I was a translator. And at the same school, the students also wanted to take teachers and the principal on tours of their neighborhood. The principal was a new principal, and he had never known anyone in the neighborhood. He kind of drove into school and then drove out and drove home. And so Marcus said that the teachers learned where we lived and worked, different territories where we stay away from, where people get killed and hurt, and we wanted them to understand our experiences. Another thing I wanted to draw attention to, and particularly in this context here, sharing this with you, is the importance of what I call intermediary organizations, or ways that schools can and need to partner with other organizations. And what I found extensively in my research is that it's really important, if schools are interested in student voice work, to find ways to really think about who in the community has as their mission and goal partnership. So the schools have missions for a whole lot of other things, achievement and test scores and all kinds of other stuff. So having an organization whose focus is partnering with families, partnering with schools, allows that mission not to get lost in the sorting of all the other things, the million different directions. So we call it, it provides a spark. It provides a way to keep injecting that intention of partnering with young people. It also helps with sustainability of by partnering with a nonprofit or intermediary organization. It shows a commitment to wanting to work through this long term. It also provides support, and sometimes nonprofit partnering can allow some extra resources, but it also is that usually these types of organizations have a network of different schools they're working with, and so they can help schools communicate with one another. They also might have training that they can provide. So really, when the study that I did this in, it was looking at some schools that had gotten funding to do student voice projects in the San Francisco Bay Area. And of those schools, I went back a couple of years later to see if they were still doing the work. And the only schools that were the ones who had an external partnership with a nonprofit. Wrong direction. So I'm going to explain this framework to you, and then I'm going to give you all a chance to work on this framework in a Jamboard. I like that Max is saying a key takeaway, take the time and energy to say what a great idea and translate students' ideas to change. And I would say in that takeaway, that teacher would have to be empowered as well. Yes, that teacher would have the confidence that if she had something, this is just she in this case, that she could go to her principal and say, my students are really fired up about this issue. Can we work on it? And knowing the administrator would say, heck yeah, let's do it. And I will provide support and help you to find the resources to do that. So there's layers of this, right? That is really critical. And then the other one around the intermediate organizations for sure. So let's look through this framework, and then I'm going to give you a choice of 3 different breakout rooms to head into, to just play around with this on a Jamboard. So you just would need to have your computer available if you wanted to, and we'll play around with some Post-it notes. When we think about implementing student voice, there's 3 things that we tend to talk about. Purpose, context, and relationships. So I'll spell those out, and then I'm going to ask you to think through what the purpose, context, and relationships are in your communities, and how that might work. So purpose is the intent of the work. And you heard in that video a range of purposes, and we would look at those as a continuum from students participating on current design and looking to improve systems. The one example is Oregon Student Voice, working with a coalition of organizations to help with something that was already ongoing around trying to get a bill passed in Congress, in the Oregon Congress. Restructuring is trying to really like redesign or rethink the way things are happening. And maybe that first example could be also a restructuring. So I would say another example of modification is, students sitting on a school board, sitting on a decision-making committee, like a hiring committee. Restructuring is really trying to rethink how school happens in ways that are often more equity-minded. So the state of Vermont created a personalized learning policy where every student in the state had a personalized learning plan that mapped out a really very different way to assess students as to whether they were ready for graduation than what we tend to think of in terms of credits and units. And then the third is the idea of dismantling systems. And that may fall within more of the activist category. That tends to happen more outside of schools, but that students are involved in those and it impacts them. So Enrique in the video talked about having a protest at their school to be able to share opinions of what it means to be a student of color at Fieldston School, which is a highly prestigious, wealthy private school in the New York City area, and some of the kids were on scholarships there. But so there's this idea of questioning that fits with some contexts and is very common in some contexts, often more in urban areas, but not always. And so there's this layer of to what extent are we actually questioning, and to what extent are we asking students to be a part of that kind of work. There's also the how of things, and this is a little infographic that I wanted to share, and I can share the hyperlink with you, of looking at what do we know about when students are doing this work with us? What does it look like? What are the contexts and conditions that seem to help it to be successful? Overwhelmingly, cultivating trust and respect is critical, particularly the greater the extent to which students have experienced a lack of trust or have come from environments where there have been layers of trauma where somebody that was important to them was not able to continue with that relationship in a way that felt safe. Students are going to negotiate, and we're writing a paper on this right now, of making sure that this is a teacher that I can trust. And student voice work isn't going to happen unless they perceive that teacher, or sometimes it's a nonprofit agent, sometimes it's a guidance counselor, whoever it is, as somebody that is known as someone who cares for kids. And students share that information as well as then engage with it personally to see. So there's this testing that occurs, and teachers need to have a sincere interest in understanding what that looks like. And we're blowing up number 1 into a paper right now. A second is celebrating successes. So when things are working, like that lunch lady example or the lunch kid example, and being able to get them on the cover of a magazine, having a press conference to celebrate what they're doing. Even a school assembly shows that even though the work of change is long and hard, that there are ways to acknowledge and honor the success of what that looks like. The third is teaching how schools work. So the kids who are in the professional development of like helping teachers to understand whether kids are going to make sense of how they're developing rubrics. They had a training session the day before to understand teacher talk and how teachers were going to be talking about curriculum, what are the words they were going to be using, what's a rubric, why are they talking about rubrics, and they also got educated on how to articulate their learning styles in a way that teachers would understand the types of content and structures that would work for them. So it was teaching them how to talk like teachers in that case. And then the neighborhood example was the flip side of the students trying to teach teachers how to understand their perspective. A flat power dynamic that can happen even in physically how you organize the space, and creating something that doesn't feel like a traditional classroom of the teacher standing above and the student sitting below. I have a photograph from India of politicians sitting intentionally on the ground and the students standing, and that was designed particularly to try to change that power dynamic in that setting. And visual cues, like I said, about physical space and things like that. Thank you, Max, for these takeaways. I appreciate that. Okay. Context is just the different spaces in which this work can happen. So learning, and we're going to do some thinking around like, what does this look like in classrooms? Organizationally, how does this look school-wide? What are ways like that schools are looking at data, and that happens more and more? And can we be sharing data with students? Can students help to interpret data and help schools to think through how they might want to be making decisions around data? And policies like holding voting power on school boards and things like that. So learning, a lot of times we call that's the YPAR, the Youth Participatory Action Research, or student-led inquiry. Examples from the research that I've done are students noticing that milk bottles weren't being recycled and how to create a program so that the milk bottles would be recycled, creating a composting program, noticing the amount of paper towels being used in the bathroom and creating a campaign to help students to use less waste in the bathroom. Understanding and talking about difference and having conversations around feeling it's not just me, but that students can talk and share concerns, and that might happen. Organizational activities, this is another different slide from the lunchroom exercise of having the whole school collectively decide the lunchroom rules. The curse of student voice is that the students change. So if you're going to create lunchroom rules, like how often do you need to do that so that those rules are shared as the students move on, as we would hope that they do. Some of the coolest examples of policy of like impacting like statewide policy are Oregon and Vermont. The organization in Oregon is Oregon Student Voice. There's also the most famous one is in Kentucky, and it's Kentucky Student Voice. And then Up for Learning is in Vermont. So these are some photos of what different things have happened. So like this this initial one of the musicians was when that personalized learning program was passed in Vermont. The students involved in Up for Learning created a music video to teach other kids and families about this policy. So it showed ways that a personalized learning plan could connect to students' own interests and help to have a more clear connection between their plans post-secondary and the ways that they're building their curriculum. And it was really catchy. Like, it was one of those jingles that then, like, you would listen to it and be like in your kitchen being like, our time, it's our time, our place, our way. And you had all these different kids from across Vermont in the video. The middle photo is from the Oregon Student Voice folks who were testifying on the Hill, or I guess, I don't know if it's a hill, but it's in Oregon. And they developed a relationship with certain Congress people and senators, and the senators and Congress people realized, like, if I'm running a press conference and I have these students speaking, it's a lot more compelling than when I'm speaking. And these students actually even helped to craft the language of a bill around sexual assault, as well as ethnic studies. This is another one of the our time things. Okay, so I'm gonna make an attempt to see if this works. I'm gonna put in the chat 3 different links, and hopefully that is gonna work. And you can pick, and it doesn't even need to be the role that you actually have, but I'll walk you through it. I mean, you can open it up, and I'm gonna walk you through before we go. So we're gonna look at the Jamboards here, and I'm gonna ask you to reflect on student voice practices that your organization implements or you want to implement. And you can put the practices down into different categories. So we're going to be thinking about, let me go to the next slide so you can see. Ooh. Okay. So there's going to be a column here around that learning, organization, and context. And then along the other side, whether it's adult-led or student-led, and then the color of the Post-it notes helps you to think about, is it more like incremental change? I think the lawnmower people are going by, so the dogs are a little excited. Sorry about that. Incremental change or systemic change, or really trying to change. So pick, I'm also gonna let you go into breakout rooms, and we'll spend just about 10 minutes playing around on these Jamboards. Ooh. Perfect time for you to go in breakout rooms because they're coming by my window. So you pick your breakout room. Wow, there's a lot of crazy going on. I'll let you choose the room. So, good Lord. So number 1 is more like district-wide things. Number 2 is family liaison, or like whatever, however you want to interpret that. And number 3 is the school level. So you pick. I can pop in and out with questions and play around on the Jamboard. And so you're going to click on the link from here to find the Jamboard, but then by having you in the breakout room, you can also talk. Okay. So the first is the district board. The second is family liaison. And this was just based on the different titles that that were shared that might be presenters, but you pick whichever you like, and hopefully the lawnmower people will be gone by the time we're done. Open all the rooms. Here we go. I'm gonna mute myself. Get some folks. Yeah, and I can mute you as well. But I wanted to get a sense if there was anything that came up that you wanted to talk about here. And I'm going to throw a few big issues that may have come up in the chat. So one is, what does it look like to build a culture where student voice is more than just a project here or a project there? What are the implications of student voice in the current era, whether it's post-pandemic, anti-racism, the way that teachers are being attacked in a lot of ways, in schools feeling vulnerable? How do we differentiate initiatives where students should be at the forefront or not? Is it realistic to think that? And before I forget, also, hopefully this link will allow you to access a copy of the presentation in a PDF format. So any thoughts at all? If so, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. I'm happy to keep talking, but I also want this to be a place where you all can ask questions.
This is Denise. Can I just ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
You know, just really getting into this feel good, but I hear a lot about the educational systems now and how a lot of the teachers and other, you know, persons in the educational field are being discouraged, actually leaving the field. Does anyone know about that? What do you think? And is that a true assessment, or what do you think? Because of course that impacts how we're proceeding with these innovative type of policies or procedures.
Yeah, I think that is definitely was the case during the pandemic, just what that was like. And I think in certain communities and states where teachers are being held responsible for, you know, if you teach about racism, you could be fined. If you talk about gay issues in Florida, things like that, teachers are feeling like they have to be really careful about what they're saying. What we know from the research of Student Voice, and we're going to be, we have some new work coming out really shortly about this too, is that notion that the more teachers are empowered, the more they're feeling comfortable and safe, the more that they feel interested and able to do this work. We're also looking at, and we don't just have a big enough sample right now to do it well, is the extent to which doing this kind of work with students actually helps to improve teacher satisfaction. Certainly we have qualitative data, and the next section is going to talk about how to gather data with and from students. But we have evidence that, you know, this is the kind of stuff that's the reason people got into teaching in the first place, is to make a difference and to help young people to do so. So the extent to which they can is important. We have Rebecca saying in the chat, I can personally say that as a former teacher, I left because of a lack of support from administration. There were so many expectations placed, and I knew what my students needed but couldn't always help them. So we often see folks like that moving more into nonprofit positions or other ways of interacting with school systems where the mission is more directed towards supporting families, supporting schools. So it is a big issue in question, but also sometimes that might be what you need to do, is be in a place where that is, you're the more of that intermediary organization able to focus on this work.
Hello, I don't have the hand raising symbol, so I can't raise my hand.
Okay.
So I guess I did it backwards. I'm a retired therapist with the courts for like 30 years, and then I got into education a few years ago. But what I have learned is, and it's kind of disheartening, two things. My skill set from the court system fits so well into the school system. That really hurt. I mean, I'm good at what I do, but that really hurts my feelings of, wow, we're training our kids for the prison system. But then secondly, recently, our whole education system has become so politicized. It's such a political hot button that I think that's what's tying our teachers' hands and what's forcing them out of this profession. Also, as an adults, we have to realize, and these are the people not in the school, we have to realize education is not about the adults, it's about the kids. And I think that thing have gotten lost. More adults are thinking this is about me and my comfort. And it's not. It's about educating the kids and giving the kids what they need to be educated, giving the teachers the tools to and the freedom to do it. I don't think we're doing that right. At least that's from my opinion from being into the field in the last 3 or 4 years. And I could be totally off base. So don't take it to heart, but that's just what my observation is.
It sounds like, based on the chat, that people are hearing what you're saying and agreeing. Elizabeth saying the biggest reason I left teaching was lack of accountability from everyone but teachers. Family, students, administration placed it all on teachers. And Denise saying absolutely about children and morale. And that's what we should be focusing on. Good stuff. Any other comments or questions?
We had a good conversation in our room. I asked a question of two colleagues who are also in the state of Ohio with me, and I just feel like I taught for 12 years, and now I'm a social emotional learning consultant, and we have buildings that are working on student voice, but it's so hard to sit and watch them do these student voice circles about the food in the cafeteria and then see all of these other students who are like, screw this, why should I be a part of this conversation when nobody's listening to the hard things that I'm dealing with about that teacher who is holding bias against me, or all of these things I'm dealing with other students. And the conversation kind of came back to, you find the ends, you find the places where you can start these conversations with the kiddos, but it can just be so discouraging to know that we're doing these little tiny things when there's such bigger issues facing our kids that can't be challenged and dealt with. So I appreciated the conversation we had about that.
Yes, thank you, Colleen. And this is one of those issues and that's where that spectrum of like issues of racism and bias and changing systems is critical. And yet a lot of times it's easier, and politically the space where we're allowed to work with young people is much more on the margins. I think that what I've seen is the schools that have the support at the district and administrative level to have open conversations about equity helps students, and certainly there's always the ongoing issue of racist teachers and otherwise, but I think when it can be done well, there's also can be a more shared understanding of the ways in which folks are working in the same direction, if there's allowed to be dialogue between students and teachers and administrators around the direction that we want to head related to equity and social justice. Hopefully, in most schools, the racist teachers are the outliers, but that without being allowed to have those bigger conversations, then it becomes tokenism, and it's not a helpful thing. One of the things that students told us in particular is really the need for that circle back around what we call responsiveness, that if students do share voice or opinions, they want to know what happens to it, that it's not just happening into a vacuum, that administrators or teachers can show the way that their ideas were heard, or maybe they were considered and there was a reason it couldn't happen, but they want to know that if they are involved, that there's some process by which there an accountability, that this isn't just speaking into a vacuum of that no one's listening. And yeah, Colleen, it's really critical, and we find this in the work, that if teachers don't have a voice, it's really next to impossible for students to have a voice. That these two things are really two pieces of the same issue, for sure. Any other things that folks want to talk about now? Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. And
I just had one thing I wanted to say. Is that okay?
Absolutely, please.
Okay, I'm sorry. I couldn't raise my hand. I couldn't find it. I had it a little while ago, and then I couldn't find it. But one of the things that I learned from one of the one of the classes that we had here that was very interesting to me, it was, it's along that family, teacher, relationship, and how at the beginning, if that teacher could develop a relationship with that family, as opposed to it being only when there's a problem, how much more progress would be made. And they even gave the example, you guys may have seen that video, but they gave the example of the teacher sharing a picture, sending a picture home of their family with the student for their parents to see. And then for the student family to reciprocate, just to get to know them, put a personal feel on that relationship, to show that you care. Those type of things up front, before there's a problem with the family, know that you care, engaging with that family and that community. To me, that would just do wonders.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. And what we're finding is that trust is just so critical for what that process is, and understanding ways to build that that rapport, and that it's about, and what we're finding, which is, you know, as we're hearing that students are feeling more threatened, is that building a caring relationship involves teachers being willing to be vulnerable, and that can feel really hard. I'll share my screen. This is like this isn't in the presentation. This is what I'm thinking about right now. Is as we're looking at what does trust look like, we're finding in our data that there's this care and benevolence component, and that's really critical and one of the most important things. And that is teachers being willing to share of themselves, and to talk about how their lives are bigger than being teachers, and when they're having rough days and when they're having great days, and taking the time to know students as more than students, but as people with families and connections, the ability to do that one-on-one. So there's a scale component here of, if you have, you know, 40 students in a class times 5 classes or what have you, or if you have a caseload of 200 students, how to make those one-on-one connections. These two were kind of the most salient. And then honesty, the willingness to, again, when things can't happen, talk to students about it, to share and be frank and speak truthfully, and be, again, that vulnerability, the openness, competence around showing that, like, that you are capable, and that students can learn and get the resources they need, and reliable, again, that kind of responsiveness of the wraparound. So those are the pieces that we're finding are underneath that idea of building trust, and that the more that can be done on the front end, the more we're setting ourselves up for strong student voice practices, as well as strong relationships with family and all those kind of things. But when teachers and anyone related to education is feeling under attack, the willingness to create that vulnerability, which is at the heart of this, is really hard to do. And so if teachers don't feel like they're in a space where they are trusted, or that administrators have their back, or what have you, the harder it is for them to extend that goodwill to others. Anything else before we keep going? Elizabeth.
I suppose that an insight I had looking at the thing you just shared with us, and just reflecting on our conversation in our breakout room, I guess that it's important for us to persevere in creating that love, that trust relationship, because as we continue that and show that and demonstrate that, we may not receive that trust, but perhaps we're laying groundwork then for another teacher, and that's going to make it easier for our student or our family in the future to be willing to make that connection if we sort of lay the groundwork. And I guess it's like anything else in education, that, you know, these kids may not understand what you're teaching them now, but maybe next year it's going to click in for them, and all of that. So, and I appreciate that with the voices here that have said about teachers seemingly maybe not being as involved, or being removed, or whatever. And I know that's my experience of truly being physically harmed and losing several months of school due to that, and then also being threatened by a parent in a horrible way that I ended up taking her to court for menacing. It's pretty hard to stay in the teaching field when that's your experience, even if you love every other kid.
Mm-hmm. That's a really powerful thing. It also just causes me to think of privilege, and to the extent that you are a person in a position that does have privilege, how that can be used. And I'm using it in a different sense of, maybe you are in a nonprofit, and you're able to speak and say things that teachers can't. Maybe you're working in a district and your position is much more solid than other people. Maybe you have tenure, or maybe you just have a certain standing. I find this as a full professor who's tenured, and at a time where universities are also in enormous turmoil. Part of me which wants to check out and do my work and do my research and talk to you all and things. And part of me is like, if I don't get involved into the politics of what's going on, who will? Because it's safest for me, but it's also easiest for me to check out when it's safest. So to what extent is it my responsibility to speak the things that junior faculty are feeling and thinking that I can say and maybe others can't for their political reasons? So I think that's part of this process too, is the extent to which the folks that can will stick their necks out and help to support one another. Yeah. Any others before we move on? This is a great conversation. Thank you. Okay. Let's talk about, make sure I have this correct. So we're just going to look at ways that if you do want to work with students, here's some examples. So in the world of research, when we're and we're going to talk a lot about data, because what I found and in the research and otherwise is the extent to which we can work with students to build off of data, the more impactful the work becomes, as opposed to she said, I said, he feels, I feel. Working and building reliable data sets around student opinions, teachers' opinions, can be a very strong and powerful way to move change. So what does data look like, and how do we create it in a way that we can use it to our advantage to help make change? We want to make sure that whatever we collect is true, that it's consistent. So it may be one person's truth, but is it the sense of the whole school? Is it the sense of all the students, all the teachers, what have you? And generalizability, how representative. So that could be like, it could be reliable and consistent among students of color. Is it representative in Latino and Black, for example, or what have you? Is the difference between reliability and generalizability. And like I said, the use of data can be particularly important in thorny issues such as talking about equity. By partnering with students to develop research questions, collect and analyze data, we can have a critical perspective that's based not just on opinion, but on something extremely powerful. So there's different ways we can collect data. There's qualitative, which is what I tend to do in my research, which is words. And those could be focus groups, interviews, journals, case studies. And on the quantitative side, it tends to be surveys, which in some ways sounds simpler and more inclusive, but it's a lot harder to do well, I think. Mixed methods brings things together. So like I said here, some of the things are more of the focus groups, and let me give you some concrete examples. So open-ended questionnaires, these are some that have been used in different spaces with nonprofits and schools. And these could be within classroom issues or climate issues or about something that's going on in the community even. So these are more classroom focused. Do you like this subject? What's fair to me expect from you? Can you think of a way I could help you on this? And understanding student behavior of when we act like this, what would that mean? How could teachers be involved? And those kinds of issues. This is the youngest. This is, kindergarten, first grade. What will make class better? I want to do more writing by myself. I feel happy in class because I like to add and subtract. Here's an example of at halfway in the semester of feedback solicitation. And this, again, could happen at a club level, at an organization level, and at a classroom level. Tell us what you would like the teacher to start doing, stop doing, and continuing. So teachers actually vulnerably asking for feedback, and then ideally sharing some of that back to the class. So this slide gives kind of a trade-off in terms of ways that we're collecting data with students. interviews can be more in depth, but they take a lot of time, but they also build that rapport that we said is so important in trust. So some of these processes, actually doing this work of data collecting, can be part of the trust building process. And the more personalized components of this, such as interviews, are a way to do that. Focus groups can be hard. Someone who's been doing them for 30 years, because and particularly with students, as to whether they feel comfortable speaking amongst each other, whether there's going to be one or two that do all the talking. I try to not, even with focus groups, have more than a few at a time, and ask the teachers to help me to make sure that they're friends. Because if they're not friends, there's no point in having a focus group. Nobody's, like, all the sharing isn't going to happen. Observations are really helpful to counterbalance what's being said with seeing what's happening, and try to understand different perspectives. And an open-ended questionnaire is a way to try to get feedback, but there has to be time and incentive for the folks who are filling it out to do so. And oftentimes they just come back blank. So whether there's class time allocated, there's some sort of incentive to encourage us, and also assurances that these responses in all of these examples are confidential and safe to be able to be shared. So always talking with students about how, when you talk to me, none of what is said is going to go back to your teacher or to the principal. It's all going to be anonymized, and ensuring that it really is. So 3 examples, and I'm not tech savvy enough to split these up, so we can use a little chat conversation to see what this looks like. But if you were, I'll move the chat over here. If you, I gave them all away. There we go. So let's just use that. So if we're considering what are student experiences with homework, that could be interviewing questions. Fishbowl focused groups are really interesting. And so I want to spend a little bit on that example. In the San Francisco Bay Area, there was a school that had as their central inquiry, why are 9th graders failing? And so they had a fishbowl where they brought 9th graders who were failing, with teachers kind of sitting on the outside listening, created a safe space, and the students told them. And it was a way to demonstrate really intense listening. The students felt heard, were able to really articulate what was going on. Again, that has to be in a safe space. It has to be a space where teachers feel safe and students feel safe. There has to be scaffolding ahead of time about appropriate forms of communication and ways in which this is a constructive dialogue, and those kind of things. That start, stop, continue form, there are ways in which the student voice practices can be about teachers helping to make their classrooms, and or nonprofits can use this to make their services more aligned to what students are wishing for and needing. So I'm going to open up the conversation again, and if you want to be using the Jamboards, I will post them again. And this time there's up at the top of the Jamboard, there is there's multiple pages. So this would be page 2. You can go back to the room you were in, or you can switch, but it'll still be the same idea of one is going to be a little bit more around district, and the second, and so I will read the prompts and questions that I had for the 3 rooms. If I can here, let me pull them up better. So I will see if I can do it this way so you can all see it. So if we go for the school administrator to, actually, it's the 3rd slide. So you will choose this group, which is group 3, if you want to have a conversation about this scenario. You're a school administrator who wants to hold a professional development session for teachers at the start of a school year, focusing on better supporting students, but you first want to understand what struggling students want and need from teachers and administrators. And the colors are more questions you might want to ask. And the green is for strategies. The family liaison question, going to group 2, that one got switched better, is you are a family liaison has been asked to assess family ability to assess internet and working computers to complete expected work. You realize you need to figure out what could be improved. So I have a few in here, but I'm going to delete some to allow you to think through. And the third one is, go to this third, your district administrators received parent complaints about disciplinary decisions being made at many middle and high schools. You want to understand how students are experiencing disciplinary processes. So before this, we're going to try this a little different this time. Before I open the chat rooms, I just want everyone to use these and click on one of these Jamboards and just use that circle here up at the top to get to this page around this question around data gathering. Spend some time on your own, just playing around with, you can just, you can, over here on the left, if you're unfamiliar, you can create a sticky note this way, give it a color, and then type in here and hit save, and then it'll show up right there on the screen. So join a Jamboard, do a little bit of self-reflection, and then in 5 minutes, I will open the chat for y'all to talk about it. So let's try it that way this time and see how that's similar or different. So right now, everyone would just go to a Jamboard, and I can see some of you already entering because I can see your little icons here. So I'm going to stop my screen share and just mute for a minute, and I'm here if you have questions. You can either speak out loud or you can put them in the chat, and then I'll open up the discussion boards in a few minutes. And as you're coming back, if you haven't already, give yourself a chance to take like a big stretch. We just have about half an hour left in the workshop, and we have one more set of content to talk about, but I'm also, as of last time, this is your time. So if there's anything that came up from this conversation or that are still bubbling up from our previous conversation, this is a great time to talk about it. As you're stretching. Any issues around how to use data with students, questions around that? And while you're thinking about that, I'll share in the chat a resource. There's not a ton of evidence-based tools for measuring student voice, but this link provides one that is generally referred to a lot as a kind of a toolkit of different ideas and things that you might be able to use. I'm going to allow space so if there is anything percolating. And if not,
I can share. Oh, sorry.
Please do.
I can share something from our group. We were in the school group, so looking at what struggling students want or need, and kind of got cut off in the middle of a conversation. But thinking about, there's an anecdote that I've heard in multiple PDs that I've been in now, and they start with this idea of like, if you're running a company and everybody is leaving the company or you have a high rate of turnover and you want to know what's going on, what do you do? And a lot of people say, well, I would do exit interviews with the people who are leaving to find out what's wrong. And they say, yeah, that's great. But what you really need to do is talk to your 20% of people who are staying and find out why they're staying. So I think when we look at our struggling kiddos, it's good to talk to our struggling kiddos, but I think the focus becomes, let's think about our struggling kiddos, let's ask them what they need, but I think we need to still look at talking with everybody and find out what our kiddos who aren't struggling are getting. Why are they able to be successful rather than just focusing on those kiddos who are struggling? So not just assuming that the group you're focusing on is the group that you need to talk to.
Thank you, Colleen. And I would say perhaps the sweet spot in there are kind of those resilient kids or who seem to be achieving beyond expectations. I think there's a huge gap in schools between who often are the leaders, and they might even be in different classes if there's tracking and such things. So there's a lot of stratification in schools, from like the most high achieving going to college to the ones who are completely failing and dropping out. And I think your point draws attention to really honing in and asking the questions in the spaces that would be most helpful. And if we're disaggregating according to curriculum or according to demographics or what have you, are we getting to the people that, so figuring out what's working for certain groups, there may be a lot of different groups. So making sure one of the most important things in research is asking the correct question. And your comment really helps us to think about that. And how to determine what makes a student struggling. And especially in the context of this conference, Elizabeth, at that intersection of family and home, and what is the role of schools, and how families and understanding families and bringing families into the picture can help to give a better sense of what that looks like. There's also, I've started out in this field being really interested in parent involvement and ways to empower families. And there's still enormous value to that. It's just, what's interesting is there's less opportunities to do that in some cases. And I'm thinking of just from I'm saying that more from a policy perspective. When we think of what Title I used to look like in the 70s and 80s, I'm dating myself because I'm 51, but there was built into the laws in the 70s an expectation of parent groups helping to help to monitor and make sure that funds targeted towards poor kids were getting spent well. And since the reauthorization in 2001, 2002 of the Bush administration, Title I has really moved from kind of more of a community-based poverty strategy to one around achievement and excellence. And there's been a loss of parent voice for sure in a lot of communities, and particularly in efforts to draw parent voice in communities that doesn't tend to have as much parent voice. I started my dissertation work out long ago thinking that I was looking at both a student voice group and a parent group. And the parent group was headed by the school hired a community activist who was known in the Latino community to help to try to mobilize and parents in that community to have more communication and interaction with the school, to hear more about the needs of that the families. And what the story of that ended up being was that activist ended up working with the students, feeling that the students had a bridge in both worlds, and that these first generation immigrant families from South America and Central America were really reluctant to interact with the school district, and not interested in being partners in the work. So that's its own set of ball of wax. But I ended up studying what he did do, which was to try to have students in various roles in the school to be a bridge between family and home, including having volunteers in the office at all times for translation when phone calls came in and people came into the office, but also trying to get the students to think about where the disconnect is happening and why and how. So it's been interesting to see, as a scholar, less attention in the literature being paid towards interactions between families and schools, and much more so as student voice growing. And I don't really know the answer to that. I think it's all important. I think also another policy that had a lot of attention in the 80s and 90s, and less so now, is just that notion of schools being the hub around which communities and families can find a variety of resources and connection points to medical care, to to substance abuse recovery, to all these kind of things. Not that schools are providing all that, but they can help to be a building in a community to provide wraparound services and community spaces, and that the school becomes more of a place where those kind of things can happen. I think with issues of safety and gun violence and things like that, there's a concern of having the school be an open space like it maybe was back in the 80s and 90s, but that definitely impacts the extent to which we can understand, to get to Elizabeth's question, like what makes a student struggling, and where are the disconnects, and how do we connect those things? Jennifer.
Yeah, your recent point talking about schools as being a hub as communities, for communities, and maybe that being less in recent years. I do think that there might be a rural-urban divide in that, because there is still some literature suggesting that in rural communities where it becomes very hard to define what is a neighborhood, that looking at a school district or a building area, right, that actually functions similar to a neighborhood if we're looking at like a more urban setting. That's the place where folks are hosting baby showers sometimes, or having celebrations of life for community members that have passed away. And it really can be the hub in some of these rural communities still of a neighborhood.
Thank you, Jennifer. And that points to a lot of concerns about consolidation of rural districts, in that those hubs are then lost and the identity of a community is often connected to its school. And if it loses its school, what happens to the community there? For sure. Denise has her hand up.
I just had a couple questions, and hopefully that it'll be quick. I just noticed, because I'm a lot around quite a few inner city. I don't live in the inner city, but I used to grow up in the inner city, and I'm in contact with a lot of inner city children, and I often hear them say that they don't take homework home. And I'm wondering if that's really the case, and why would that be the case? And again, if it's not the case, if they do actually have homework to take home, how is it dealt with when some of the parents at home can't really help them with their homework? That's one thing. The second thing is the absentee rate being high in the school among some of these students. Does the school have a liability to report that when students are absent more than a certain amount of days consistently?
Yes. Yeah. So to answer your second question first, there are still truant officers, and there are still attendance requirements that are related to visiting families to understand where students have gone. A lot of times they're, like I can think of Allentown, Pennsylvania, that required their schools to standardize their curricula across elementary schools in particular, but I think maybe even high schools as well, because of the transiency between schools, so that if students who kept getting evicted, or families who kept getting evicted or what have you, were switching locations, that the continuity of the curriculum would stay the same. But your other question about homework, I can say that I have some colleagues that study homework, that the research shows that homework up until a particular, maybe like high school, is not correlated with children learning more. So often then homework is more of an indicator of the richness of the family environment, of, certainly, and when I think of like math curricula in elementary grades, there's an expectation or an understanding that the idea might be to like play games with a family member related to the math games, around what was done in the classroom. And a lot of conversations are happening nationwide as to the importance or the value of homework versus encouraging reading. Reading every night with children is something that has been shown to be valuable and important, and practicing math, but in a way that's not necessarily tied to a student's grade. And then that changing as students get older, perhaps. So I think a lot of schools are changing their understanding of the purpose and the intention of homework, maybe not across the board, but that is changing for sure. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay. We are starting to lose a little energy. I get that. We're going to go to the third thing, and we probably aren't going to have a full breakout session around this, but I am open to that. So let's just think more about general conversation and questions. I'm going to share my screen again. And a lot of schools are expected to create ways to show continuous improvement. Districts are as well. Nonprofits are supposed to show ways that they're living up to strategic plans. So we had that conversation about what data and evidence look like. How do different inquiry cycles help us to involve students in processes? So this notion of continuous improvement has come up in so many spaces, and it's just like the hot thing right now, of the idea of how do we bring data together to inform better decisions. This is usually a cyclical process that is ways to look at problems in the system, try to improve them, test some ideas, and involve those who are being considered a part of it. So when we enable equity into these inquiry cycles, it connects to that idea of like what data matter and why. And this notion of making a plan, giving an idea, trying to collect data, reflecting on what we've learned from that, and adjusting. And there's a lot of emphasis of kind of trying to make things more like the Silicon Valley has like all the and this what does innovation look like, and having much smaller cycles than like a whole school year. Like, let's try for the next month to do this, so that there's more adjusting and ways of moving forward. So usually these 4 steps are considered to be plan, do, study, act. So in a youth adult partnership, it might be identifying students and adults together, identify what a shared concern is happening at the school. And again, we're talking about deeper issues that teachers and administrators might normally collaborate alone. So this isn't necessarily lunchroom rules, although those can be really important. A youth-driven cycle also could be something that if youth and young people are given permission to, or have spaces in which they can identify issues. We see a lot of youth-driven cycles, for example, in the European Union. There's a whole, and it's not just parallel, it's part of the process of a youth council that is able to bring measures to the full European Union. So there are whole processes in which youth are one of the contingencies, youth being defined as, I think, 16 to 25, that then create their own initiatives and agendas and bring them forth, and they can become law. So planning examples, doing examples would be testing solutions or strategies and collecting data, maybe surveys, maybe other things. Studying, analyzing what we've learned from an experiment of trying out a new way. Maybe it's a new discipline policy. Maybe it's a new process for how a nonprofit interacts with families. But actually taking the time not just to try a new idea, but to the reflection and the consideration part are often what gets lost in the shuffle of then acting to whether you want to, so maybe it's a small group of family counselors that are trying an initiative and we're gathering data to understand if that would be something more impactful, and then expanding it more broadly. So the idea, but I think with the time that we have, and I just am sensing some energy flagging here, would be to consider what this might look like in different for different folks and for different forgive me, I'm going to stop sharing for a second there. So I would encourage you, as you're thinking about how decision making occurs in your organizations, whether data is collected, who's a part of that, how that's cycling back to think through of who's learning about the data and are decisions being made that are informed by data. To what extent can young people be involved in that? What we find that's extremely powerful is having young people at the table while data is being interpreted and considered. It allows, sometimes it's different interpretations of what was said. If it was like focus group or interview data, sometimes it's really different understanding of survey responses. So the folks in that 5-minute video at the front, they've been a part of our research team for the past few years. And so they code our data. So we go out into the schools and we collect data. They don't necessarily travel with us all the time because that's hard. And our collection sites are in other parts of the country, but then they take the transcripts and they do multiple rounds of coding, of identifying themes and helping us to make sense of the data itself. And that is a critical part of our process of how we make sure that our data is reliable, that we understand, is really bringing students in on those decision-making processes. And so Kim, Kim, will you share a little bit more about your PDSA cycles and the extent to which that might be something that involves students or not?
Sure. I think we all do these all day long. It just, we don't want to put names on them. Like in Ohio, we have the Ohio improvement cycle or the Ohio improvement process. And it's, you have a question, you research it, you experiment. It's the scientific method too. So we're doing this all the time. We just are putting a name on it and that freaks people out. But I really think that, it's a good life skill for students have. They need to know that they just can't jump in and, if you could allow them to experience this in a safe environment that's guided and instructed by adults who practice the cycles as well, I think that's a great opportunity to learn and grow.
Yeah, thank you. And it just seems to be more and more the ways that we're expected to have what we call like a tighter coupling, whether it be test scores or other data to measure what's going on and why, and use that to inform decision making. Stacy, you want to share what you put in the comments?
Hi there. I was just going to agree with Kim. I'm glad she brought that up, is that Ohio does leverage Ohio's improvement process, which, it's using that PDSA, at the district level, building level, teacher-based team level, any kind of engagement level in a rapid problem-solving cycle so that you're looking at data, identifying what the root cause, like why is this happening, and then coming up with, how can we fix this, and then developing a plan to fix this, and then implementing it, and then at some point reflecting, did we get the impact that we wanted? And if not, do we scale up? Do we fade? Do we intensify? Always cycling around that Ohio's improvement process. So, and that the family and student voice in all of this is so critical, because they are our clients, right? They're our clients, and we have to know, is this working? How is it working? And they're a critical force throughout the entire process.
Yes. And I just encourage, an expansion of creativity as to what data count and why. I think, in other parts of my world, it's that notion of like, yes, test scores matter, and what else? What are broader and more creative ways that we can gather data from students and families and otherwise, and even in the classroom, more broadening the portfolio of how we assess students, to be able to think about, are we really measuring what we intended? And what data would actually be most useful to answer the questions we really want to ask, and who would be most best to help to analyze that data. It can take more time and energy to train and have students and family members to be a part of the assessment process, but it also, if they do a great job, like Paula and Bailey do from that video, it makes our lives, it makes our load a little lighter, in the sense of it's shared work that they're doing, but it also just helps us to be assured that what we're doing is valid. And that in itself is a really critical part of the process. Any other thoughts or questions about that work? It also just can make it, like, I don't know, when I'm told I have to do this around like my learning outcomes in my classes, it makes me tired. But if I can find ways to involve my students in that process, again, just that spark of like why we're doing this work in the first place, it makes it a lot more interesting and meaningful. Yes, so Shane is a good friend from college. Shane Saphir put out a book recently about different ways to collect data with young people. And it's a good brainstorming of considering different ways to do that. It's a great book. Highly recommend Shane's book. And Elizabeth's saying, I think we have to be able to find and share the value of collecting data, because it's partly like, yes, everyone has to do these cycles, but you're doing them with scarce resources and not a lot of time. And so then you kind of sometimes just throw it together as quickly as you can. And that's just us doing all the, juggling all the balls in the air at the same time. But to find ways that it's meaningful, to find ways that intermediary organizations and nonprofits can also help with that part of the process of connecting other people and sharing ideas across units, and using data in more creative and interesting ways is for sure a part of that. Okay, with just a few minutes left, I wanted to be able to share some resources with you that that we have at the end of the presentation. And I think, so I'm hoping that if if the presentation gods worked out, that the PDF has, the links are clickable, but if they are not for any reason, am I sharing? Are you all seeing? I don't feel like you're seeing what you need to see. Let's try that again.
We saw your desktop.
Are you seeing yeah, now you're seeing the correct desktop. The other one was just not so helpful. So here's a collection of evidence-based resource practices on student voice that have been particularly helpful to others. So those, and each of these pictures should be clickable on the PDF that I sent to you. Also, communities of practice. So I told you about Kentucky Student Voice, even though I didn't give an example of that. They have a wonderful website. Max and I were talking earlier about how he's studying student voice as a doctoral student. I'd encourage everybody to join the Facebook group Student Voice Research and Practice. There's over, I think we're up to, this is old, and that was 1.5. That was about 1,500 members maybe 5 years ago. We just keep growing. It's a place where I'm one of the moderators, and when any great research or resources come out, I put them here. If there are folks who are looking to have help with data analysis and issues, we throw it there. So it's just a space of practitioners and researchers from around the world who can gather information quickly. We also have an international journal of student voice that is open access. We have about 10 issues out. We encourage practitioners and students to publish as well, but it's also peer reviewed. If you're somebody that's going through a master's or doctoral program, we require the abstract is friendly at the 10th grade level so that students also can make sense of this work. So these are some more resources. These are my own resources. The blue cover book here on the left is more about secondary schools, and on the right more about elementary schools, and then down below are more publications. And if you can't access publications from where you are, just email me and I can send them to you. So I'm easy to find at Penn State. My email is even just Dana@Penn State. And I apologize that you all are probably all Ohio State fans, and I really don't have it great. So I will stop. I think that's my last slide. Yeah, that's my contact information right there, and happy to answer any questions or shoot me an email if there's anything I can do or provide for you. And then I think I'm supposed to end and leave this slide up here. Thank you all, and I'm happy to stick around if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, hope you have a wonderful Friday and weekend, and appreciate you all spending the time with us today.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And I will drop, and thank you, Dana. This is great. And I will drop a link in the chat. If you haven't, please fill out our survey. It will just really help us to improve our summit from year to year. But yeah, thank you everyone for being here, and have a great weekend.